Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and freshman English, and we now turn in our textbook to pages 80, 81 and following. We're going to be doing a comparing of literary works. Do you see that term at the top of page 80? So right away, let's go ahead and point out, your textbook is asking of you that you focus at level what? If you're comparing two texts together, level what? Level 3A. So let's write that down right away. So we're going to be looking at two texts. The first one is called Checkouts, text by Cynthia Rylant. And then the second is called The Girl Who Can. So in our first bit of work, we're going to pay attention to this notion at 2B of what specifically we are trying to learn from skill sets. Comparing points of view is what we're working with. So we're going to have the narrative point of view. You'll want to write that down on page 80. First person point of view is, of course, the individual telling the narrating the story, the first person pronoun I. You have a third person point of view. The third person point of view can take several different types. The omniscient point of view allows for the narrator to know what everyone is thinking in the text. And the third person limited point of view will see and report things through only one, usually one, character's eyes. Okay? You've also got a little Venn diagram there that I recommend that you'll be using as well. And then as well the cultural perspective at the very bottom. Okay? It is often the case in our text that we're looking at this cultural perspective. A character's point of view can be strongly influenced by the customs and beliefs of the place and time in which he or she lives. Notice how the perspective of the girl, you're writing this down because this is focusing you. Notice how the perspective of the girl in each story, one an American teenager and the other an African child, is affected by her culture's ideas and attitudes about the roles of women. So that's huge, so you'll want to write that down. We're looking now at a cultural perspective, looking at ways in which culture thinks about women. Now, speaking of women, we have two women who will be writing for us. The first one is Cynthia Rylant, and she will be the author of the first text, Checkouts. Let's read about her on page 81. Cynthia Rylant spent 4 years, born in 54, by the way, 1954. Spent 4 years as a child living with her grandparents in a small town in West Virginia. To that degree, she would probably relate very well to those of us who have grown up in Worland, a small town. With no public library and little money to buy books, she started reading comic books. This is huge. By the way, a lot of our writers who we will study in high school started out reading comic books of any number of kinds. Now, of course, we have lots of manga and other kinds of readers today of different types of comic books. Back in the day, of course, these comic books were a little bit more all the same, but she starts out reading comic books, right? Once in college, she discovered great literature, but she did not consider becoming a writer until she took a job as a librarian and began reading children's books. In her work, Rylant draws upon her experiences as a young adult. The best writing, she says, is that which is most personal, most revealing. She's written many award-winning stories, poems, and novels. We're going to look at now her text called Checkouts. It's a very brief story, but again, I'm going to challenge you in this text. You want to write this down. Let me give you a heads up. I'm going to ask you, do you think this is a love story? So write that down. And what would that even be, a love story? Okay. And we're going to ask about the title. So write that one down in 2B. When we finish, we're going to ask about the title. What is the title of this text? Like, why is it significant for Checkouts? All right, let's just read along now and enjoy the text. Cynthia Rylant's Checkouts.
Checkouts by Cynthia Rylant. Her parents had moved her to Cincinnati, to a large house with beveled glass windows and several porches, and the history her mother liked to emphasize. "You'll love the house," they said. "You'll be lonely at first," they admitted, "but you're so nice, you'll make friends fast." And as an impulse tore at her to lie on the floor, to hold to their ankles and tell them she felt she was dying, to offer anything, anything at all, so they might allow her to finish growing up in the town of her childhood, they firmed their mouths and spoke from their chests, and they said, "It's decided." They moved her to Cincinnati, where for a month she spent the greater part of every day in a room full of beveled glass windows, sifting through photographs of the life she'd lived and left behind. But it is difficult work, suffering, and in its own way, a kind of art. And finally, she didn't have the energy for it anymore. So she emerged from the beautiful house and fell in love with a bag boy at the supermarket. Of course, this didn't happen all at once, just like that, but in the sequence of things, that's exactly the way it happened. She liked to grocery shop. She loved it in the way some people love to drive long country roads, because doing it, she could think and relax and wander. Her parents wrote up the list and handed it to her, and off she went without complaint to perform what they regarded as a great sacrifice of her time and a sign that she was indeed a very nice girl. She had never told them how much she loved grocery shopping, only that she was willing to do it. She had an intuition which told her that her parents were not safe for sharing such strong, important facts about herself. Let them think they knew her. Once inside the supermarket, her hands firmly around the handle of the cart, she would lapse into a kind of reverie and wheel toward the produce. Like a Tibetan monk in solitary meditation, she calmed to a point of deep, deep happiness. This feeling came to her reliably, if strangely, only in the supermarket. Then one day, the bag boy dropped her jar of mayonnaise, and that is how she fell in love. He was nervous, first day on the job, and along had come this fascinating girl, standing in the checkout line with the unfocused stare one often sees in young children, her face turned enough away that he might take several full looks at her as he packed sturdy bags full of food and the goods of modern life. She interested him because her hair was red and thick, and in it she had placed a huge orange bow, nearly the size of a small hat. That was enough to distract him, and when finally it was her groceries he was packing, she looked at him and smiled, and he could respond only by busting her jar of mayonnaise on the floor, shards of glass and oozing cream decorating the area around his feet. She loved him at exactly that moment, and if he'd known this, perhaps he wouldn't have fallen into the brown depression he fell into, which lasted the rest of his shift. He believed he must have looked the fool in her eyes, and he envied the sureness of everyone around him, the cocky cashier at the register, the grim and harried store manager, the bland butcher, and the brazen bag boys who smoked in the warehouse on their breaks. He wanted a second chance, another chance to be confident and say witty things to her as he threw tin cans into her bags, persuading her to allow him to help her to her car so he might learn just a little about her, check out the floor of the car for signs of hobbies or fetishes, and the bumpers for clues as to beliefs and loyalties. But he busted her jar of mayonnaise, and nothing else worked out for the rest of the day. Strange how attractive clumsiness can be. She left the supermarket with stars in her eyes, for she had loved the way his long, nervous fingers moved from the conveyor belt to the bags, how deftly, until the mayonnaise, they had picked up her items and placed them in her bags. She had loved the way the hair kept falling into his eyes as he leaned over to grab a box or a tin, and the tattered brown shoes he wore with no socks, and the left side of his collar turned in rather than out. The bag boy seemed a wonderful contrast to the perfectly beautiful house she had been forced to accept as her home, to the history she hated, to the loneliness she had become used to, and she couldn't wait to come back for more of his awkwardness and dishevelment. Incredibly, it was another 4 weeks before they saw each other again. As fate would have it, her visits to the supermarket never coincided with his schedule to bag. Each time she went to the store, her eyes scanned the checkouts at once, her heart in her mouth. And each hour he worked, the bag boy kept one eye on the door, watching for the red-haired girl with the big orange bow. Yet in their disappointment these weeks, there was a kind of ecstasy. It is reason enough to be alive, the hope you may see again some face which has meant something to you. The anticipation of meeting the bag boy eased the girl's painful transition into her new and jarring life in Cincinnati. It provided for her an anchor amid all that was impersonal and unfamiliar, and she spent less time on thoughts of what she had left behind as she concentrated on what might lie ahead. And for the boy, the long and often tedious hours at the supermarket, which provided no challenge other than that of showing up the following workday, these hours became possibilities of mystery and romance for him as he watched the electric doors for the girl in the orange bow. And when finally they did meet up again, neither offered a clue to the other that he or she had been the object of obsessive thought for weeks. She spotted him as soon as she came into the store, but she kept her eyes strictly in front of her as she pulled out a cart and wheeled it toward the produce. And he, too, knew the instant she came through the door, though the orange bow was gone, replaced by a small but bright yellow flower instead. And he never once turned his head in her direction, but watched her from the corner of his vision as he tried to swallow back the fear in his throat. It is odd how we sometimes deny ourselves the very pleasure we have longed for, and which is finally within our reach. For some perverse reason she would not have been able to articulate, the girl did not bring her cart up to the bag boy's checkout when her shopping was done, and the bag boy let her leave the store, pretending no notice of her. This is often the way of children, when they truly want a thing, to pretend that they don't. And then they grow angry when no one tried harder to give them this thing they so casually rejected, and they soon find themselves in a rage simply because they cannot say yes when they mean yes. Humans are very complicated, and perhaps cats, who have been known to react in the same way, though the resulting rage can only be guessed at. The girl hated herself for not checking out at the boy's line, and the boy hated himself for not catching her eye and saying hello, and they most sincerely hated each other without having ever exchanged even 2 minutes of conversation. Eventually, in fact within the week, a kind and intelligent boy who lived very near her beautiful house asked the girl to a movie, and she gave up her fancy for the bag boy at the supermarket. And the bag boy himself grew so bored with his job that he made a desperate search for something better and ended up in a bookstore where scores of fascinating girls lingered like honeybees about a hive. Some months later, the bag boy and the girl with the orange bow again crossed paths, standing in line with their dates at a movie theater, and glancing toward the other, each smiled slightly, then looked away, as strangers on public buses often do, when one is moving off the bus and the other is moving on.
Now this is an interesting little story, and the place that we're going to begin is actually in the story itself. I'm going to start on page 85 with you, and you see it there in the third paragraph from the bottom on page 85. Humans are very complicated. Let's write that line down, and let's spend a few moments musing about the ways in which this story is almost like an essay of a kind that seeks to try to define that very idea. Humans are very complicated. She, of course, follows that up with a bit of irony about cats, right? And if you know anything about the great T.S. Eliot, he was in agreement that cats and humans share in common this notion of curiosity and, of course, how complicated everything is. Now, let's look at the story itself, and let's ask a few quick questions. I want to start by asking you, though, at 2B, what's up with this title? So let's go to checkouts. So what's up with this title, and what is it that's kind of ironic and fascinating about the use of the word checkouts to have a double meaning? Do you get me by double meaning? Jot down how there's two meanings to checkouts in this story. Of course, one obvious is you're checking out at the grocery store. What's the other use of this word checkout? Of course, it is to check someone out. That is to say, to try to figure them out, to try to understand them, or literally just to try to see them in some way, right? So notice that Cynthia Rylant is playing an interesting game here with us by saying to us, human nature is very complicated. It's a bizarre thing. Let's go ahead, though, and watch the ways in which this story builds brilliantly. It's actually a brilliant little text. Let's begin, first of all, with the opening lines. Notice, by the way, what's the name of the girl in the story? And what's the name of the boy in the story? Isn't that fascinating? Rylant is not going to give us names. For example, not Romeo and Juliet. No, we don't have any names. But what we do know about this girl is she was forced to move from a small provincial town where she had friends, where she enjoyed her life, to a large city called Cincinnati in the state of Ohio. Did she want to go? Notice the opening lines. She says that it was suffering. It was hell for her. Now, it's significant that the word suffering gets used. Let's pay attention to that one, right? The parents, of course, will tell her, it's decided. In other words, at 3B, a time in your life when an adult in your life made a decision for you that you clearly were not pleased with, but you had to accept it because it's kind of the way it works out, you know what I mean? We mention in the next paragraph something about difficult work, suffering, and in its own way a kind of art. Now, for those of you that know anything about comparative religious studies, since we are talking about culture of a kind, and later in the story Tibetan monks get mentioned, let's just remind ourselves that Gautama Buddha sat under his Bodhi tree, and when he reached enlightenment, what was the first thing that he learned about human existence? Life is suffering. And she says it. My life was suffering. So I just sat in a house and did absolutely nothing all day. But, she said, over time, I finally decided I would go out, and going to the grocery store is for her almost a form of strange Tibetan monk-like meditation. She's going to go to the store. By the way, notice the interesting little paragraph at the bottom of 82, where she makes the distinction between kids and adults. She says, I didn't want to let my parents know too much about me. I wanted to kind of keep something to myself, so I didn't let them know that not only was she willing to go to the grocery store, she actually enjoyed going to the grocery store. Another 3B question. Do I have any of you in here that enjoy going to the grocery store? It's a bizarre thing. I've had students that actually say, totally resonate with this, kind of like just walking into a grocery store. And even when I'm on the road somewhere, I have students who have graduated and gone on and traveled, and when they come back from Japan, from Brazil, from Germany, from wherever, I'll ask them, what's one of the coolest things you did? It is amazing to me how many times they will say, coolest thing I did was go to the grocery stores. In downtown Tokyo, had all this stuff to see, but the thing that fascinated me the most was walking into a grocery store. Dude, you walk in and the fish smell just attacks your nose. It's amazing. They just have fish market right in the middle of the grocery store, and then all the other stuff, grocery stores. Once inside, she's in the grocery store, she does her thing, and then of course, she will meet her guy. On page 83. I call it her guy, but that's a bizarre way to call it, isn't it? Because with the exception of dropping a mayonnaise jar, they have absolutely no contact with each other whatsoever, which does beg the question, is this a love story? Notice it begins with a great line, then, one day, the bag boy dropped her jar of mayonnaise. That's how she fell in love. Now let's point out, at 2B, for our notes now, that when we are talking about point of view, and by the way, don't be confused, in 303 we use POV to mean two different things. Points of validation are what we mean when we're talking about writing and defending our positions in our writing. POV as it relates to fiction is what we call point of view. For your notes, let's make sure you've got it. Point of view just simply means who is telling the story, from what perspective. And here, notice, we have a point of view of third person, right? Notice there's no I went to the store, I saw the bag boy. But notice that the person telling the story knows the thoughts of both the girl as well as the guy. So we will call this an omniscient perspective, right? Now, there she goes. Notice, first of all, she sees him. He is nervous, right? First day on the job, he notices her. The red, thick hair with the orange bow. Notice how they become kind of symbolic then. What do you want to say about the large orange bow that the girl wears? Maybe she likes drawing attention to herself. Maybe she doesn't care what other people think about her as she goes to the grocery store, right? She loved him at exactly the moment, and if he'd known this perhaps, he wouldn't have fallen into the brown depression he fell into. What's interesting about brown depression? Of course, he's a bag boy. And what does he do? Back in the day, there are no plastic bags. The question of paper or plastic didn't occur when you were a checkout boy. You simply had paper bags, which were, of course, what color? brown. Notice that word picture of falling into the brown depression, falling into the bag. He is totally into her. She is totally into him. Neither one of them know it. And so they go through this very interesting, what do you want to call it? What's the adjective? Maybe dance? Now let's talk about this notion of love at first sight. Of course, the Greeks had this idea, right? That the goddess of love and beauty, Aphrodite, has a little son named Cupid. He's got a little bow and arrows set, and he shoots his little arrows into the heart of a guy and into the heart of a girl, and then of course they head over heels in love. They cannot not fall in love. Love at first sight. By the way, at 3A, put a note. When we hit Romeo and Juliet later in our freshman year, we're going to ask the same question. Because, of course, Romeo sees Juliet for the first time on a dance floor, and he walks right up to her, complete and total stranger. Would this be strange at a mall? You do not know the other person, and the other person, the guy, walks right up to the girl and says, "Can I have a kiss?" Whoa! First line. Doesn't know her. Walks right up to her. "Oh, can I have a kiss?" She says, "I'd love to kiss you." And he's like, "Sweet." And she puts out her hand. And she says, "Let's kiss hands." Kiss just means touch. And he goes, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, this is good news for me." Hands together. Then he says it, "Can we let lips do what hands do?" And she says, "Well, of course we can." Because, and now he's getting really excited, because she says, "Look at what the hands look like when they're together. Like this, it's high five. Turn it like this, it looks like you're praying." Now all of a sudden she says, "Let's pray." Is that what you mean? Let's pray together. And immediately Romeo's into this girl. Why? Because she can banter back and forth. Notice, that's a story from 1600 roughly. That's Shakespeare. This story is a modern story. Anybody reading the story knows the story of R&J. Yeah? Just like we will as freshman students later as we study it. But notice nothing's said here. That's significant. There's nothing said, which leads to all kinds of speculation. And the idea that in the minutes that you want something, you can't articulate that you